pleasure.
Oh, Rosemond, I might have to take over. I think you have connectivity issues.
Have each and every one of us here. Look at the big year from wherever you're joining us from, different parts of the world. I see Fredos. Tell us your name. Tell us where you're joining us from. I have David Iraka. You're welcome. Tell us where you're joining us from. Thank you very much for being here. Super exciting. Please share the link once you come across this on your screens. Please share the link with someone. Let them know that something amazing is being brought to you here live from the Africa the Big Deal team. As you can see on my screen, we already have the amazing Maxime and Max Giacomelli. So you're very, very welcome. I will definitely do the introductions, just very short, but let's have more comments. Yes, we have more comments coming in. We have Isaac from Ghana. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for joining in. We'll do this in 30 seconds and we will move straight to it. We're definitely going to keep this under wraps for at least minimum of an hour. Yes, we have Sarifan Norazen said Yasin from Ireland. You're very welcome. We have Yishak Feltwork. I apologize if I don't pronounce your name properly. I'm from Ethiopia. You're very welcome. Obama Joseph. We have Obama Joseph from Growth Africa in Kenya. We have Theobald Gill from Ivory Coast. You're very welcome. We have Genko Sanli from Lagos, Nigeria. You're very, very welcome. We have Chinwe Michael from Nigeria. We have Ryan Oliver from Johannesburg, South Africa. We have Bebe Nabufor from Cameroon. We have Tracy from Kenya. I love it. I love it. I love it. We have Marina from Lesotho. We have Vincent from Amsterdam. So thank you very, very much. I love the energy. Please, let's keep it up. You can also tell us where you're from, what you're expecting from this very short webinar before we start. Salome, thank you for joining in. Love is just dialing in from Lagos. We're going to do this in the next 10 seconds and I would yield the mic. We have Gunther from Germany. You're very welcome, Gunther. Jerry, we have Jerry from On Global Ventures joining in from Amsterdam. We have Volinivia from Cape Town, South Africa. We have Lawrence from the Netherlands. We have Ivo from Luanda. We have different countries here represented. So definitely we are so excited to bring to you once again the Africa the Big Deal. My name is Rosemond Phil-Othihiwa, legal practitioner from Lagos, Nigeria. Privileged to be the moderator for this fantastic session with the amazing team from Africa the Big Deal here represented, Maxime and Max Giacomelli. You're very welcome, sirs. I'm going to yield the mic to you. Please keep the introductions coming. I'll be highlighting them and, of course, putting up some information coming our way. It's so exciting to see you on screen. Please ensure to engage with someone and make sure you have fun and ensure you take notes. And, of course, there's so much more to gather from the reports that will be shared today. So, making welcome the amazing team doing fantastic work in the venture capital, private equity, and startup ecosystem, both within the continent of Africa and beyond. We celebrate you. Thank you so much for being here. And I yield the mic to you. Welcome, Max. Welcome, Maxime.
Thank you very much, Rosemond. Great introduction and a lot of energy, as always, from you and from the rest of the room. It's great to see so many people joining from so many different places, mostly on the continent. I think we have more than 120 people live at the moment, so that's great. If you're here, you probably know about us already, but just a couple words about Africa, the Big Deal. So this is a project that we started a few years ago now with Maxime, with great help from quite a few people, including Elodie. And we do two things. One is a newsletter that we try and publish every week, almost every week, that basically analyzes data about investing in Africa, investment in startups in Africa, sorry. But this is all basically based on a database, which is a project that Maxime started back in 2019. So more than 5 years of deal now, more than $15 billion of deal in the database, where we track every single transaction over $100,000 on the continent, and we gather, I think, more than 30 data points per transaction. So not just the value, but the sector, the location, the founders, the gender of the CEO, and so on. And so this is a wealth of data that is very useful to entrepreneurs who are raising, researchers, but also VCs who are trying to keep their fingers on the pulse, if I can say, and for me who does the analysis. Great. So I will jump in straight away. We've got quite a bit of numbers and things to go through. Um, some of it will be new. So I'm very excited about that. So let's start with the latest numbers, basically. So here, what I'm showing you is basically a view of how much money startups in Africa have raised on a monthly basis since the beginning of 2019. So obviously, it's very small here. I don't expect you to read all the data. But just a few housekeeping notes. So most of the slides, and unless Maxime or myself tell you otherwise, include data from equity, debt, and other types of investment, which are a minority, but grants, for instance, or green bonds, for instance. They do exclude otherwise exits because it skews the numbers quite heavily, and also because the amount is not always shared. The amount basically the companies were sold for. So basically, what you see, if you look at the latest numbers on the right hand side of the slide, is that we're still in a phase since roughly the second half of 2022, where there's been a slowdown on investment compared to the heat wave that happened between 2021 and 2022. Most months this year have been between $50 and $200 million raised by startups. Usually these numbers are bumped up when there's one or two mega deals of $100 million plus happening during the month. But you see this is kind of the new normal since the second half of 2022. Now, if we aggregate the numbers by quarter, which kind of starts showing you a little bit more of the trends and something a little bit more readable, if I can say. So here we're looking, the bars are basically the amount raised by quarter by startups in Africa. So you can see in the last quarter, so Q2, April, May, June this year, it's about $300 million that were raised by startups. But what's interesting also to follow, because the amount is one thing, but the number of startups raising is another, is the gray line shows you for each quarter how many startups raised at least $1 million. And what you can say basically is that, again, since the second half of 2022, we've gone back to levels that were pre-heat wave, and you had this spike in the middle between mid-2021 and 2022, where there were incredible amounts of energy and activity on the continent. Q2 was a little disappointing in terms of number of startups raising more than $1 million, especially after Q1 was like kind of the third quarter where we'd seen growth in that area. But obviously, as you look quarter by quarter, it is still quite granular. So when we look in a second at the kind of half-year data, you'll see it's slightly more positive. So that's, again, looking at the data, and I can see my slides have not formatted the way I had, so hopefully it doesn't look too bad when we look to the next slides. But basically, this is showing you the data adding up the quarter. So you can see for Q1, Q2 for this year on the right-hand side, there were levels that are quite below 2022 and 2023 levels, going back to what we had roughly in 2021 before the beginning of the heat wave. Now, if we are to look at aggregating numbers again, and now looking at half year, so comparing the first half of 2024 to the previous years, so $780 million were raised by startups in Africa in equity, debt, excluding exits in the first half of the year. This is to compare to 1.8 billion in the first half of 2023, 3.2 billion in the first half of 2022. This is also below the levels that we'd had recorded in 2021. The numbers are better, though, if you look at the number of startups that have raised at least $1 million during the period. You can see that there were just over 100 of them in the first half of the year this year, which is quite comparable. And sorry again, formatting issue here, to what we'd seen last year at the first half of 2023. And in 2021, with 2022 being an exceptional year. So if we want to look at the glass half full, there are still a substantial number of startups that are raising funding on the continent, around 100, who raised more than $1 million in the first half of the year. Now, again, piling up the number, looking at half years. So as we could see in the view, looking at the quarters, the numbers don't compare very favorably to 2022 and 2023. What's interesting, and we'll come back to that at the very end of the presentation, is like what will happen in H2. And that the question will be, will H2 be like in 2022 and 2023, a slower semester, or will things be starting to pick up, to kind of make up for the lull that we're recording until now? So now this is again zooming back, kind of showing you trends to just see how 2024 is comparing to the 5 previous years. So at the bottom you have the 2019 and 2020 numbers, pre-boom, if I can say, where you can see 2024 is kind of comparing to what we were seeing at that time. Then you have 2021. You can see until the first half of the year, it was a normal year, I would say. And then you have this kind of explosion in the second half of 2021 that you find in the first half of 2022 as well. And if you look at the lines, basically since mid 2022, the curves have started to flatten a little bit compared in particular to that period. What it means, looking at the numbers again, is that in the first half of 2024, there's 780 million, dollars that were raised on the continent. That compares to 1.8 billion last year at the same time, 3.2 billion in 2022, and 1.3 billion in 2021. So we're still tracking quite low compared to these numbers. What's interesting to look at as well, in particular, if you want to compare with other regions in the world where we only have the data through CB Insights for equity, and we'll come back to that in a second, is if you're looking at equity only. And so out of the 800 million that were raised so far this year by startups in Africa, 500 million was in equity, the rest mostly in debt. I'll come back to that in a second. And that compares to 1 billion last year, 2.8 billion in 2022, again, an exceptional year, and 1.1 billion in 2021. So it's about half of the amount that had been raised at the same time during the year, in 2021 and in 2023. On the point of the split between debt and equity, here we can see a trend. Though this gives you the data, the split between equity, debt, and other types of funding raised since the beginning of 2019 by semester. And what we can see clearly, basically, is that there's a significant increase of the amount of debt, the share of debt, in what startups are raising. Over the full period, over the past 5.5 years, it's about 81% equity, 17% debt. But if you look at the past 3 semesters in particular, you're about 2/3, 1/3, if not even more, for debt. There are many reasons for that. One is the fact that startups are probably more likely to publish and communicate about debt that they're raising, which they were probably less likely to do, in particular in a context where everybody was raising equity. But that doesn't explain it all. I think it's there is more offer in terms of debt on the market, and more investors that are offering this as an option for startups. And also in a bit of a bear market, it sometimes makes a lot more sense for startups to raise debt to fuel their growth, as opposed to raising equity, especially if you're at a time where valuations might be a little bit on the low side. So I think this growth of debt is a result of many different trends underlying them. So that's on what happened in the first quarter of the year compared to previous years. And I will now move to a geographical view, like where is that money being invested, before I hand it over to Maxime, who will look at the different sectors and so on and so forth. So this is a map that we shared, I think, a couple of weeks ago now, that basically shows you the amount of startup funded. So the amounts of funding going to startups in Africa in the first half of 2024. So what we're seeing here is a few things, obviously, which we'll go into details in a second. But one that obviously jumps to us is the share of the Big Four, the four largest markets in Africa that raise consistently more than 3/4 of the funding on the continent. So this is the map, and I'll show you now another map, which is a little ugly, but just to show you basically if we were to use the same scale, what were things looking like a year ago. So this is H1 2024, and this would be H1 2023. So basically, this is a visual way to show that there has been a significant shrinkage in terms of amount invested on the continent, and that this affects mostly three of the Big Four, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. If you look at Nigeria, it's holding, but if you look at the other three, they had a pretty exceptional first half of 2023 in the global context, but couldn't quite keep up in the first half of 2024. Now, if we look at the split, so here is the split between Western, Northern, Eastern, and Southern Africa. There is Central Africa here, but unfortunately, it represents about less than 1% of the total funding. So you don't see that much, but it's in gray on the slide. So this is the share, the evolution of the share from 2021 until 2024, obviously only looking at half of the year. So we see quite a few things here. If we start with Western Africa, back in 2021, it was half of the funding raised. And then that share shrunk in 2022 to a third, to just a fifth in 2023. And now it's picked up again. It's about a third of the funding raised, kind of like a close second to Eastern Africa, which represent more than a third of the funding raised now. And for Eastern Africa, though, you can see that that share has been growing consistently since 2021, from 14% to a quarter, to nearly a third, to now nearly 40%. If we look at the other two regions, Southern Africa, kind of flip-flopping from a quarter to just 13% of the total, to about a fifth, to now about 11% of the total. And Northern Africa is another region that had done well in 2022, 2023, rising to about a quarter of the total raised around the continent, but now is down to 15%, mostly due to basically the polarization of the funding, if I can say, between Eastern and Western Africa. Now, looking at the same data, but basically calling out the Big Four, to just give you a sense of how much they represent in their relative regions. So if you see, Kenya is the vast majority, I think 85 to 90% of the funding raised in Eastern Africa is raised in Kenya. The same could be said around Egypt. In South Africa, it's even more. You usually have 95%, if not more, of the funding raised in Southern Africa that is raised specifically in South Africa. The big difference that we're seeing, though, is on Nigeria. As you can see, the share of funding raised in Western Africa outside of Nigeria is actually growing over time, and is actually quite significant, in particular in the first half of this year. Now, if we look at the same data again, pull out the Big Four, and then put everything into 50 rest of Africa countries, which is obviously not very fair. But you can see that the rest of Africa, if I can say, is growing a little bit, I think, overall, but still only representing about a fifth of the funding on the continent, which is obviously not its share of the population or its share of GDP. And I have a slide on that in a second. So staying on this topic, rest of Africa versus Big Four, there's not a very strong trend here, even though in the past 4.5 years, there are 3 where the share of rest of Africa, hate this term, but it makes it easier to explain things here, is over 20%, even reaching nearly 30% in H2 2023 and in H2 2022. But obviously, this can always change, because if you look at H1 2023, it was actually the lowest share of rest of Africa since we've been tracking the numbers since the beginning of 2019. So overall, across the period, since in the past 5 years, about 83% of the funding that goes to the Big Four and 17% of the funding that goes to the rest of Africa. Which takes me to my last slide. This is a slide that I shared, I think, a year ago, and that I've updated now. So on the left, you have the Big Four, which represent 83%, as I just said, of the funding raised by startups in Africa since 2019. So just 4 countries. And then on the right, you have 50 countries that have attracted only 17% of the funding. And at the bottom of the slide, it's just a reminder. So the Big Four represent 31% of the population and 50% of the GDP in Africa. But their weight in terms of attracting startup investment is much higher. Good. So that's it on the geographies. I will now hand over to Maxime, and I'm hoping that we don't have any more formatting issues in the slide you'll be presenting. Over to you, Maxime.
Thanks, Max. Hi, everyone. Great to be here again. And yeah, I'll be talking a little bit more about the sectors now. So if you can move to the next slide, Max. So not a ton of surprise here. I mean, those are sectors that have been historically quite big when it comes to startup funding in the continent. What is a little bit more surprising, though, is the respective weight of these leading 4 sectors. We actually have, for the first time, a new sector leading the pack, and that's logistics and transport, with 28%, that now has overpassed fintech, which is only at 23%. Historically, fintech has been really the leading sector, always above 30% for the past couple of years. And so, yeah, that's definitely a difference. In the third rank, we have now energy and water at 17% of the total funding, and agri and food just below 10%. What's interesting is to also look at some of the leading deals in those sectors, because they are, of course, driven and by some of these mega deals, especially logistics and transport, energy and water, with Move in Nigeria, that has driven a significant chunk of the total amount of deals or amount of dollars rather in the logistics and transport sector, and then M-Kopa, Spiro for the energy and water space. And this is actually going to continue, because a startup called Delight has just raised also a mega round a couple of days ago. So that will increase the energy and water space. And then we have M&T Alan in Egypt that also raised, I think it's $150 or $170 million in the past couple of days. So the fintech sector will grow. But it's important to keep in mind that, because of the amount of funding is not that much in total, any large deal above $100 million is actually having a significant impact on the total sector. If we go to the next slide, so it's not looking the way it should be, but basically we'll share the deck after with the formatting the way Max did it, which is much nicer. But in a nutshell, here we basically are showcasing the 27 startups in Africa that have raised over $100 million in the past 5 years, so since 2019. I'm sure a number of you are quite familiar with some of these names. And what's interesting is to see that basically these 27 startups represent $7 billion of funding, which is close to half the total amount of funding raised by startups in Africa in these past 5 years. So again, a testimony of the fact that this ecosystem is still small, and that basically 27 startups can represent half of the total funding. What's interesting is to see how these have evolved in the past. So here the formatting is a bit tricky, but what we wanted to show is that the only new startup in this selection of 27 is actually Spiro this year. Everything else was basically from last year. And then we have 2 startups among, again, these 27 companies that have actually shut down or close to shutting down, unfortunately. That's Grow Intelligence and Copia. And we have another 2, Wasoko and Maxab, that actually have merged. So, if we look at the sort of the net total here, it's actually a little bit less and closer to 24, 25. In terms of the total number of startups that have raised north of $100 million. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. So we come back to the sector slide. What we wanted to show now is a new lens that we started applying, I think two or three quarters ago, which is the climate tech sector. We decided to create it as a separate sort of filter altogether because there's overlap with existing sectors. So while, for instance, all the startups in the energy and water space are climate tech, that's not necessarily the case for the ones in logistics and transport, but some are. For instance, electric vehicle startups, for instance, would fall there. So we decided to create it as an additional filter. So when we apply this filter to existing sectors, we can see that basically climate tech investments represent 43% of the total amount of funding raised by startups in 2024 so far, which basically is equivalent to $332 million. And that, again, as I said, it's basically overlapping with some existing sectors. For instance, a small bit in the fintech is actually insurtech solutions. For instance, like a startup like Pula, for instance, would fall there because they focus on crops insurance, which is basically falling also in climate tech. We can now go to the next slide and see the proportion of climate tech over the years. If we leave aside the second half of 2020, which was driven just by mainly one large deal in the renewable energy space, basically we have seen the climate tech sectors growing in proportion of the total amount of funding since around 2020, and now close to $1 in 2 deals, $1 in 2 dollars rather, invested in startups in Africa is going to climate tech. So that's definitely an interesting trend that is now growing over the years. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. So that was basically the last one for sector. We're now going to look at the gender lens, something that we try to share a lot in our regular newsletters. So for those of you who subscribe to the newsletter, these slides will be quite known. Unfortunately, not a ton of changes on that front. So the top graph basically shows the proportion of female CEOs and male CEOs in the total amount of funding raised by startups this year so far. So we have at 8% of the funding going to female CEOs so far this year. And then the bottom graph rather, is looking at the gender balance of the funding teams. So basically the bottom blue is only male founders. The middle one is a diverse funding team. And then the tiny bit in yellow is female only founders at 1.6%, which is quite low. And, one could gain comfort in thinking that this has grown over time, but unfortunately, if we go to next slide, we'll see that this has not grown over time. It's actually fairly flat. Here we're looking at the gender of the CEO, and we are at 8% now. But last half year was 9%. Before that 6%. Before that 7%, and it basically fluctuates like that. The only time it's been more than 10% was the first half 2021, and that's mainly driven by Grow Intelligence who raised a significant round, I think around $80 million at that point, and that had a big impact on this ratio, as the founder is a woman. But since then, it's been basically quite flat, and unfortunately, we're not seeing any change there. The same goes for the gender mix of the funding team. We're at 1.6% now, and it's basically quite sure if we do the average since 2019, we're close to 1.6% as well. So unfortunately, quite flat there, and you can see that basically 85% of the total funding goes to funding teams that are only male, and that's been the case for as long as we have been tracking this data, unfortunately. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. And I will hand over to Max.
Yeah, I'm happy to cover those. Thank you very much, Maxime. We'll come back to you in a second. And again, apologies for the formatting issues, but as I said, for those of you who subscribe to the newsletter, we'll make the a clean PDF version of the deck available to you tomorrow morning. So look out for it. Good. There are a couple more things that we wanted to look out before we look back at the what it could mean for the future. One is obviously behind all those deals, we see usually the startups, but there are investors, a lot of them being active on the market and fitting this side of the deal. So here what we're showing you is the number of investors that were active in at least one deal over $100,000. So it doesn't mean they themselves have put $100,000 into the deal, but that the deal itself was $100,000 or more. And here, just to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, we're comparing the first half of 2024 on the right to the first half of 2021, 2022, 2023. What we're seeing is that there's slightly less active investors on the continent in the first half of 2024 compared to previous periods. That's the drop compared to 2021 and 2023 is not that big at the end of the day, but when you compare to H1 2022, which is the heat of the heat wave, if I can say, that's where you have a bigger issue. A bit worried about the formatting of the next slide. No, that worked. That stood. So that was good. So here, bear with me for a second. What we've tried to do is obviously an investor's active in Africa can mean a lot of different things. Can mean an investor who's doing one deal opportunistic on the continent during that period, or can be an investor that does many more than that. So that's what I'm trying to show on this slide. So the lighter blue basically is investors that have done just one deal over the period on the continent. The darker blue are investors who have done between 2 and 5 deals, which might not seem much, but over a 6-month period, that could mean almost like a deal a month. And then you have those kind of super active investors, the one in gold, that have done more than 5 deals in the semester. And what we're seeing here is obviously there is not only a shrinkage of the number of active investors, but also of the most active investors. And the most dramatic comparison basically is looking at the first half of 2022, when nearly 50 investors had done more than 5 deals on the continent, which was like nothing short of incredible, compared to this year so far, with only 7 investors have crossed that bar. Some of them are the usual suspects, and I'll come to that in a second. But you still have obviously a majority of investors doing more opportunistic deal. That can be just because they're starting to explore Africa, or because sometimes they're doing bigger deal and obviously they're doing less. Sometimes they might just be not your traditional investor, but that sees like a very good strategic play on one deal in Africa. There are many reasons behind that. So who are those 7? Top of the list is Launch Africa, 12 investments. That means they have done an investment every other week since the beginning of the year, if my math is right. They have traditionally been one of the most active, if not the most active investor on the continent. They have done around 140 deals with their first fund, which was deployed around the heat wave period. There was a little bit of a lull as they were raising their second fund, but now that they have raised fund two, they're going back to the top of the chart with 12 investments during the period. They're followed by names that we have seen in the past periods, Techstars, Catalyst Fund, and here, full disclosure, Maxime is involved heavily with Catalyst Fund, but also Renew Capital, DFC in the US, Baobab, and Y Combinator. Again, here, there are levels of in terms of number of investments. For instance, for Y Combinator, still puts them in the top 7, but much lower than we had seen in some periods where we had sometimes dozens of African startups joining YC cohort. It's not really the case anymore. It's more a handful each time. I will just add one thing to add to those. So here we're looking at we've excluded exits, and we've also excluded grants because they're a little bit different. But that probably becomes a bit of an eye test for you. But if you include the grants themselves, there are quite a few providers actually that have provided a significant number of $100,000 plus grants. So there's DEG in Germany, they've done 8. There's MasterCard, CC Hub, and iHub, who have each done 12. So that gives them a very important weight in obviously in the ecosystem, given how things are a little bit slower now. When you add up those deals, it's quite a bit. There's also the GSMA Innovation Fund, and full disclosure here, I work for the GSMA and manage that. And we've announced 8 grants over that period in the first half of the year. So that's on the investor side, and obviously behind every single one of these 286 plus investors are people who are usually bullish about the continent and ready to just go against the global trends or the local trends to keep investing in startups. So the work that they do is particularly important to keep fueling the ecosystem. The last thing I wanted to cover before handing back to Maxime is comparing what is happening on the continent to other regions. So the bit in gold is our numbers here, where you'll see it's only $500 million because we're only looking at equity, because we're comparing those numbers with CB Insights number that only look at equity. So everything in blue here, the source is CB Insights, not us. But basically that shows you that unfortunately there was a period where Africa was back to back with Latin America, competing with them, in particular because the post heat wave hit Africa later than other continents. Unfortunately, now Africa is back at the bottom of the charts. I don't like to look at this slide and think oh, Africa is doomed, because we know it's not. I like to see it as a massive missed opportunity that the people we saw on the previous slide have identified. When you look at the share of Africa in global funding, global startup funding here, it's well below 1%. If you compare to the share of GDP, which is around global GDP, which is around 3, 4, 5%, depending on the numbers you look at, or the share of population, which is, I think, 18% and will grow to 20 very soon and even higher, that is your missed opportunity. You have a lot of investable startups, a lot of markets that are just ready to be explored. So this number is a bit of an anomaly. Another thing, and as Maxime will be looking into the future in a second, what we're seeing is a bit of a rebound on the 3 key regions, North Africa, Europe, and Asia. We're starting to see the trends looking better than they looked during a pretty dire 2 years, which gives us hope as well, because we see that global trends tend to hit Africa or benefit Africa in this case, probably 6 to 12 months after they affect North America or Asia, for instance. So any kind of positive sign on the US or China or the UK, for instance, which were the 3 countries that attracted most funding, could mean positive trends for Africa in the future. So I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Maxime, who will just sum up and then look into the future briefly. Over to you, Maxime.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, so a couple of recap points here on what has happened in the past 6 months. So yeah, unfortunately, the total amount of funding dropped around 30% versus the second half of last year, and actually close to 60% versus the first half of 2023. We still have around 80% that goes to the big four markets, so that is fairly flat over the years. We have a new sector that is now leading, which is transport and logistics, on the back of a couple of large deals in that space. And when it comes to gender balance, we still have 98% of all the startups that raised funding in the past 6 months at least one male founder. So things are fairly flat there as well. On the equity versus debt front, it remains it's a trend that really continues, with basically around 33% of the total amount of funding raised by startups in Africa that comes from debt. And yeah, something that was much needed in the past couple of years, and it's good to see this evolution. We can move to the next slide, which was a question that I've seen quite a few times in the chat earlier today, and we're looking at the future of startup funding in the continent, so especially at the next 6 months. Again, here, if we compare with the past 3 years, 2024 is really trailing behind. And so we try to look at the upcoming 6 months scenario. So we have two scenarios that are fairly similar, because at the end of the day, now we have already half of the year gone, and our expectation is that the total amount of funding in Africa for the year will be between 1.5 billion and $2 billion, which is, yes, quite below the 2023 level. Actually, around $1 billion short. Not even talking about the heat wave of 2021, 2022, but still above the level of 2019 and 2020. Why am I sharing this? Is because if you compare with other regions, for instance, US, Europe, and LATAM as well, the funding levels that they are reaching this past couple of months are actually lower than the 2019 and 2020 levels. In this case, in Africa, that's not the case, and that's something that is still positive. As Max said, we are seeing growth again in the VC space in the US and Europe. Historically, we have seen that these trends come to Africa with somewhere between 2 and 3 quarters after. So that's why the sort of the funding winter has hit Africa a little bit later than the US and Europe. But yeah, therefore we can be cautiously optimistic that these rebounds will reach Africa in the coming months. I think that's our last slide. Yeah. To find out more and to get access to all the data, as Max shared earlier, feel free to take a look at the database. So we have the URL here. I've shared it as well in the comments. It's basically the entire raw data, by the way. So there's not a tricky platform that you need to play around to access the data. You basically subscribe, and then you have access to all the data since 2019, in a nice, easy, ubiquitous Excel format. And then, of course, the brilliant newsletter that Max writes on a very regular basis, that you can subscribe to on Substack. As we said, the presentation that we shared today will be available on our newsletter later today, for those of you who want to access it. And yeah, I think with that said, I just wanted to maybe thank again Max for the great presentation. He's the magician behind all these slides. So it's most of the credit goes to him. And then of course Elodie in our team was entering all these deals one by one and cross-checking the data on a regular basis as well. And last but not least, thanks a lot, Rosemond, for facilitating this live.
Thank
as
you.
well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with this, we've come to the end of this presentation. Definitely, I see some questions. The slides are definitely going to be made available. And I'm pretty sure possibly the recordings, it doesn't go away from your screen. So you can always go back and watch for as many times as you want. So I just want to say a very big thank you to the team. Thank you everyone from joining from different parts of the continent. We appreciate you and beyond. Till we come your way next time, a very, very big thank you to everyone. Please keep the comments going up. Please feel free to drop your comments. I'm pretty sure Max and Maxime will be able to respond whenever they can. So a very big thank you once again to the entire team. Looking forward to seeing the next time, and we do hope that more things get better within the funding ecosystem in the African continent and beyond. Thank you everyone for joining, and bye for now.